In my last video, I discussed what is, in my opinion, the biggest problem that Path of Exile 2 must solve in the coming updates. The gear power problem, where far too much of a typical character build's power comes from their gear, especially the weapon. This is extremely noticeable at any stage of character progression, and it's part of the issue of why the passive tree is so boring and underwhelming at the moment, along with many of the ascendancy options. But if the weapon is the most significant part of this problem, then the boots slot and movement speed in general is a very close second. This is actually a much bigger issue than it first seems, and that's because there are so many layers to the movement speed problem, and I feel like it's going to be a difficult one to solve for GGG. Now in patch 0.3, they've added the sprint mechanic, and generally speaking I think this has been a fantastic addition to the game. It's a decent solution to the concerns voiced by many players about traversing barren areas during mapping and in the campaign, and whilst I feel the sprint mechanic has a few rough edges with knocking into awkward terrain areas and getting mini-stunned and things like that, it's certainly an overall positive addition to the game, and they can refine it to be better over time. But sprint doesn't solve many of the issues for in-combat movement speed, and this is the core of the problem. In Path of Exile 2, movement speed is one of the most desirable stats because dedicated movement skills don't really exist. Technically, you could say a skill like the reworked shield charge is a dedicated movement skill now that it doesn't have a cooldown, but it's not quite like the shield charge from PoE 1 in terms of its freedom of movement and fluidity, and this leads to clunky movement, which is why movement speed is such a powerful stat. You want to be able to move faster. After all, movement speed is essentially a multiplier on whatever it is you're doing, whether it's allowing you to farm faster or allowing you to dodge a boss mechanic. It's something that pretty much every build cares about having, and this leads to a similar issue to the weapon slot with the boot slot. Boots absolutely must have movement speed on them. If they don't, they're trash. Which very much reminds me of the gem levels modifier on weapons. Now this is something which is much less of a problem in PoE 1, where even though movement speed is still a very valued stat, its impact can be offset by the use of dedicated movement skills. Frostblink and Flame Dash, for example, do not care about your movement speed, and it's not uncommon to see very good builds that don't invest all that much into movement speed. In fact, some builds don't invest anything beyond just a basic pair of boots, because they simply don't need to. Meanwhile, you still have builds in PoE 1 that do invest massively into movement speed and fly across the screen at the speed of light. For example, a dedicated lab runner or heist farmers. Both extremes are true in Path of Exile 1, but the same cannot be said for Path of Exile 2, because if you don't invest into movement speed, you move like a snail. And this leads to more problems. You're weaker defensively because you're more likely to get hit and get swarmed by monsters, and you progress much slower, you loot slower, everything is slowed down as a result of a low investment into this stat. But part of this issue is also the current balance of the game. Right now you're able to absolutely delete bosses and other monsters with moderately good gear, and when damage is no longer a problem for your build, the next best thing is naturally going to be speed. So that's the core of the problem. You essentially need to invest into movement speed because there are no good alternatives. But let's discuss some of the aggravating factors. I already touched on the fact that outside of the rare Queen of the Forest build, boots without a movement speed modifier are pretty much useless. But in patch 0.3, this issue has only been exacerbated with the change to Essence of Horror, which now removes a random modifier and adds the 100% increased effect of socketed items modifier to gloves or boots. And that's a problem because Farrell's Rune of the Chase exists. This basically just compounds the issue. Now, you not only want boots with a movement speed modifier, but suddenly socket limit is a problem too, as is the 100% increased effect modifier. Together, this is the difference between 30 or 35% movement speed boots and 60 or even 65% movement speed boots. That is a massive difference. It's almost as much of a movement speed difference as going from no movement speed boots to a pair of 25 or 30% movement speed boots. So what this means is that pretty much every build now wants these exact boots. Good movement speed modifier, 3 sockets, and the essence mod along with 3 Farrell's runes of the chase. But did you know that you're actively being punished for investing heavily into movement speed? Hidden movement speed penalties on gear. Yeah, some people may not even know about these penalties, but body armors and some shields impose a significant movement speed penalty on your character when they're equipped. Pure strength gear is the worst offender here, with pure strength body armors imposing a 5% movement speed penalty, whilst pure strength shields impose a 3% penalty. Then you have hybrid strength body armors at 4% and hybrid strength shields at 1.5%, and lastly, non-strength body armors impose a 3% penalty. Now, this doesn't sound too bad, and this is a system that already exists in Path of Exile 1, so it's just something that they brought over from the original game, right? Or is it? Because in PoE 1, this system is actually calculated differently. In Path of Exile 1, the movement speed penalties on equipped gear are reduced movement speed modifiers. This means that they are additive with any increased movement speed modifiers that you have. In other words, you can cancel out the 8% reduced movement speed penalty from having a pure strength body armor and shield equipped by having 8% increased movement speed. But in PoE 2, this is not the case. The movement speed penalties imposed by equipped gear in Path of Exile 2 are less movement speed modifiers. They're multiplicative reductions to your movement speed. For example, if you have 35% movement speed boots, you'd have 135% base movement speed. If you equip a pure strength body armor, you now have 5% less movement speed, so you go from the 135% of base movement speed to 128.25%. Yes, you lost almost 7% movement speed from the penalty. And the crazy thing here is that you're actively being punished for more and more investment into movement speed. Let's say instead of 35% movement speed boots, you have 60% movement speed boots, 30% from a modifier and 30% from 3 socketed Farrell's runes with the 100% increased effect of socketed items essence modifier. You have 160% of base movement speed, so the 5% penalty from your body armor is lessening that to 152%, or an effective 8% reduced movement speed penalty. And keep in mind that this is only accounting for movement speed from the boot slot. Most builds have many other sources of movement speed, for example buffs or from the passive skill tree. Now this gets worse for those typical mace warrior builds that are also using a shield. They have a total 8% less movement speed penalty coming from their body armor and shield combined. So if they have 160% of base movement speed, they have 147.2% after the penalty, or an effective 12.8% reduced movement speed. That's completely ridiculous. Now let's move on to another part of the movement speed problem. Moving whilst attacking versus being locked in place. Yeah, this one is crazy, because when you look at the two extremes here, it actually seems like we have two entirely different games. On one side you have skills like Sunder. You cannot move while you're using it, and the skill has a 35% base attack speed multiplier. Really? 65% less attack speed? What on earth is going on here? Then you have the massive majority of ranged attack and spell skills that can be used while moving. And this is made worse by the fact that being melee in Path of Exile 2 is not really the safer option. There's a lot of on-death monster effects and ground degens that range builds rarely ever have to interact with. And the latest addition to the game, Abyss, has a whole bunch of those. Then there's the passive skill tree. Not only is movement speed far more accessible on the right side of the tree, but there's also a bunch of stats that make the comparison of these two sides even more apparent. On the left side you have two-hander damage wheels that have reduced attack speed modifiers on the notables. Then on the right side, there's a bunch of nodes that reduce the movement speed penalty imposed by skills. So essentially, builds that already couldn't move while attacking now have to stand in place longer to complete their attack, whilst builds that have freedom of movement while they deal their damage can now move even faster whilst dealing damage. Yeah, something is not right here. And to show just how strong these reduced movement speed penalty nodes are, there are builds that are pathing all the way from the top of the tree down to the ranger area just to take all of these nodes so that they're freely able to move whilst casting spells like Spark. That is crazy. The amount of nodes they're spending to path down there is a huge investment, but this is such a massive upside. You can't even do something like this in PoE 1. Being able to move at full movement speed whilst using your skills is wild. Now, I think you should be able to move whilst using skills like Sunder or the Mace auto attack, but you should incur a movement speed penalty just like ranged skills do. I don't see any reason why a Mace character wouldn't be able to move and reposition whilst they're using their attacks, considering the majority of quarterstaff attacks can do just that. And this is just another example of one of those thematic entries into the game that may have made sense at the start. You know, a character swinging a heavy hammer must stand still, visceral combat feel and all that, but now it just doesn't really fit into the game anymore. And speaking of things that do not fit into the game, what is the Rhoa mount skill? This ability just has to go. I'm surprised that it even made it past patch 0.2, but now after 2 leagues of this skill completely breaking the game, I don't think there is any saving it. It's just a poorly designed skill that has no place in Path of Exile 2. It goes against pretty much everything they designed the game around initially, and I'm not sure how they're okay with the Rhoa existing in a game where a bunch of skills have time-locked stand-in-place animations. But that is pretty much it. Enough ranting for one video. That's the movement speed problem in Path of Exile 2 currently. Do you think GGG are going to take steps to fix this issue in patch 0.4? Let me know by commenting below. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.